Hey everyone, it's Anne. Just a heads up that the last part of our conversation, this is a 17-minute discussion about Beyoncé's cover of Jolene and where we think Cowboy Carter will rank in her discography and why Elamine thinks that Jolene is the only skip on the album. This is exclusive to paid subscribers. So if you already know that you want to hear that, head to culturestudypod.substack.com and subscribe. I also just want to say that if you can swing it, a yearly subscription is so helpful for us as we try to figure out our budget and continue to plan out the show. It's normally $50 for a year, but if you already subscribe to the Culture Study newsletter, you can add the podcast for just $30 a year. Just throwing that out there. Okay, on with the show.
Beyoncé shows up at the CMAs, and she's performing with the Chicks. To any reasonable and rational person, you would think the stage is currently, occupied by a lot of royalty. Perhaps I should be rising to my feet. Perhaps I should be celebrating the presence of Beyoncé and the presence of the Chicks and the presence of this combination in front of me. And what do the CMA do? But not much, honestly.
Yeah, we're at the CMAs and
yeah. The Country Music Awards, and they're kind of like, who is this lady? Why is she here? I think I should be fair to the CMAs and say, like, a couple of people were quite excited by Beyonce's presence. Yes. But you wouldn't say that was a warm room for Beyonce. No. And at this point, she's already, Beyonce with a capital B. And so it feels pointed. It feels like they're trying to say there are people who do this genre and belong in this genre, and we're not really sure that you are one of them.
Part of the reaction had to do with the Chicks' presence, right? Who are persona, I'm doing the Latin plural here, non grata, within the CMA for many different reasons. But most of all, just just excised from country history for daring to say that they were ashamed of George Bush coming from Texas, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And so part of it, it's Beyoncé on stage, but also having the gumption to invite the Chicks on stage with her. And when I was rewatching the clip this morning, I noticed how few cutaways there actually were.
The camera stays very close.
Yes, they're like, we don't want to make this complicated by showing it. Like, it takes halfway through the performance before the first cutaway that I noticed to Miranda Lambert, who's like, like this is the inverse of Taylor Swift doing her awkward one person standing
at every single performance.
Single performance.
This is important for this discussion because there is sort of like an award show watching grammar you have to be familiar with in order to know how that performance was landing. And when you see Beyoncé and the amount of attention that the crowd is getting during that, when any performer is up at the Grammys, even if you don't know who they are at all, there are cutaways to people just jamming and vibing. Yeah. There are dozens of cameras in the room prepared to capture the most excited person, and you just don't get that in that room. You really think of the CMAs as the most gatekeepy of country music shows, and then here were the people they're trying to keep out the gate on the stage, and the room is not having it.
I'm Anne Helen Peterson, and this is the Culture Study Podcast.
I'm Elamine Abdul-Mahmoud. I am a fan of country music first and foremost, and I'm so excited to be here, pal.
What else do you do?
Well, professionally, I'm a country music listener, but for a living, for a living, I host a podcast called Commotion for CBC, for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
So part of the reason I really wanted to have you on the show is because, like me, you are a fan of country music. Like me, you're a fan of Beyoncé. And I think there are a lot of people who can situate this album in a much more rigorous musicologist way. But I want to have an interesting conversation about this album as a country album and screwing around with genre. And the idea that seems to be all over the place that this isn't a country album.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get into all of that, that's we have some established scaffolding. Should we go to the questions that listeners have and allow them to unpack some of these corners for us?
I am so ready. Let's do this. Let's talk talking about Beyonce at length is one of my favorite hobbies, so let's do it.
You could do it forever.
Yeah, 100% you could.
Okay. Our first question is from Kelsey.
This album feels academic to me, like it's a thesis on country music, much like Renaissance felt like a thesis on house music. It's clear Beyoncé did the research and the reading, though since I'm not as familiar with country music as a genre, I'm curious about the references and influences that can be heard on the album, especially as it seems like she is drawing from a few different eras of country music.
Woo!
So I totally agree. I was listening to it today and I was like, does Beyonce create her own syllabus? Does she collaborate with like musicologists to come up with the syllabus? Like, how does she know everything to read and to know? You know, like, because she's drawing on so many different references and thoughts. Like, and she doesn't tell us. Like, I want her to have like a process blog, but that's not Beyonce's style.
That's not how she operates. I love the idea of this record feeling like an academic record, like a work that is like to be mined, to be engaged with in that way, because like Beyonce is largely a conceptual artist. She's been a conceptual artist for maybe the last 12 years or so, since 2013. So when Self-Titled came out, halfway through her career, she sort of switches modes and becomes this largely conceptual artist. The albums are not albums; they're sort of explorations of ideas. You know,
Yes.
you get Self-Titled, which is like different explorations of the nuances of womanhood in that particular moment in her career. Lemonade explores all these nuances of marriage, you know. But then the two albums that people don't really talk about is like The Gift, which is the accompanying album of The Lion King. I honestly really recently revisited it. It's like a really beautiful meditation on parenthood. I'm not gonna say I listened to the Lion King album because it's because I'm not out here trying to, you know, embarrass myself like that. But it has like these really gorgeous moments. She did that album with Jay-Z, Everything Is Love, went under the name The Carters. You know, we try to forget about some of those moments. But she's now, you know, in this Renaissance project, and to me, the Renaissance project is like a project of repatriation. It's a project of there are musical ideas that have been divorced from their history, and that is not going to sit well with Beyonce. So Beyonce is out here. You can sort of imagine her being like, nope, this belongs in my museum. Thank you. This belongs in my museum. Thank you. And she's taking all these ideas back. She does it for house and techno music, which has become like largely disembodied from its Black history. And then with a single album, she manages to sort of recreate that history or sort of replace that history sort of up front. And then she says, I'm making this country album. And everybody's like, oh, here we go. This is a big moment for country music. I think it's a significant moment for country music because this conversation has been ongoing in the genre of country music before Beyonce arrived. And that's important to note. And then the album comes out. And I think the album comes out and we don't get a straightforward country music album. There are plenty of songs that you're like, well, I've heard plenty of country music. And this surely does not sound anything like this.
There's no talk about cold beer in my hand.
Not one beer in my hand reference. A bunch of horses, though, I gotta say. More horses than you'd think there would be.
There's so many horses.
And I think like the larger argument that she's making here is like I think you can read this album. I think you can read Cowboy Carter as like unsettling the sediment of American popular music. It's sort of like uncover that at the very root of it all is Black music that created what we think of as country music. And she does all of this musically. She never does it lyrically. She's really not interested in like spelling it out for you. It's like all the music sort of overlaying on top of each other, having conversations with each other. The idea of, you know, a song that samples the Beach Boys. The idea of a song that samples, you know, these boots are made for walking.
Yep. Same song, right? Too. It's the same song.
That's right.
Like that's doing something interesting.
It's doing something very, very interesting. You know, even the very opening of the record. You know, she sort of tells us in American Requiem, there's a lot of talking going on in a style that is like she's sampling with her voice For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield, which is a protest song. Like this. That's a protest song about genre and the history of genre and how genre got us to this place.
And then segueing into Blackbird.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Into a cover of Blackbird that is like, it's interesting that it's a cover that is bringing forth a new generation of young Black women to also sing with her. She's recalling the history of Blackbird, which Paul McCartney has talked about a billion times as this song that is about the Little Rock Nine, that is like about a history of civil rights in the South. Again, like that song has been divorced from those conversations. I think most people think of Blackbird and go, a pretty song about a bird, you know?
Yeah, they think about it like as the same as like Here Comes the Sun or something. Right?
It's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is like it's not part of the nature collection of the Beatles, actually. It's a part of the it's part of a deeper and more meaningful, more nuanced history of the Beatles. And for her to sort of say, this is a song that I will sort of feature these Black women on, that in itself is a significant statement. Beyonce knows how to talk a lot without talking.
Yeah.
She can create psychodrama. She can create conversations in your head, and that's her artistry, is like making you think about two ideas by juxtaposing them next to each other while trying to make a record that is like semi-competitive, that's trying to get on the charts and in fact end up, going to number one. So that's part of what makes her, the greatest living artist in popular music right now.
I think that she does something that is really hard to pull off, which is to make a text that is, you can unpack it in so many different ways, right? Like it rewards re-listening and like going very academic into all of the different footnotes and references and everything that she's sampling. But it also works even if you don't do that, right? Yeah. And that's always a challenge. Like I remember reading James Joyce in college.
Yeah.
And professors being like, oh my gosh, it's so incredible, right? And like it does become incredible once you understand like this is referencing this to do with this piece of Irish history and all that sort of thing. And I love coming to understand and appreciate the work in that way. But I don't think that, and this is, I don't know, a controversial Joyce take, I don't think it works when you don't know those things, right? And just like I think that sometimes like William Faulkner, like these things fall apart if you don't have the tools to read them. But I think with Beyonce, she's doing both things at once. And that's what makes her a popular genius. Like she's operating in both of these registers.
She's coming to you as a historian and an archivist who can say, here are all the tools you need to understand how we got to this musical moment. You can do the thing that people do when they engage with pop music and go like, this is fun and I want to dance.
Yep.
Or you can go, this is history. This is a library and I'm going to spend my time trying to figure out and decode all the connections and the ways that these ideas are engaging with each other. And the fact that it works in both dimensions is not easy at all. I say this as one of many people who have tried to write the vegetables into a popular story.
Right.
Like all artists, all writers, all creators try to do this, try to be like, I need you to understand this thing about this larger idea.
Yeah.
But also it should be fun to read and engaging. And so many times people are like, I'm just here to dance, buddy. And Beyonce's like, if you're here to dance, that's cool. Get on the dance floor. But if you want to do some history, maybe spend 5 minutes looking into why I made this choice and not 100 other choices.
The other thing that I would recommend for anyone listening is to check out, there's an episode of Sam Sanders' podcast Into It about the whiteness of country music. And he has on Tressie McMillan Cotton, who is one of my favorite scholars and also a country music fan.
Yes.
And they talk about the history, the Black history of country music, how country music was disarticulated, like hillbilly music was disarticulated from quote unquote race music, and how like what we think of as contemporary country evolved from that decision. And there's this great moment where Tressie points out that like the standards of country music today, like how incredibly white, straight, and masculine it is. Like no other industry would people be like, that's chill. Right.
And in fact, it's getting worse. Like that's what's actually like incredible about country music is that like even with all the people pointing at all these problems, in any other industry, you'd have the industry go like, oh, maybe we should evaluate.
We should have a reckoning, right?
We should have a reckoning. There's a doctor. She's not a doctor. She is an academic. Dr. Jada Watson. Love Dr. Jada, and what she does is sort of look at, years and years and years of the data of country radio and country charts and who the country music industry is elevating. And y'all, the diversity in country is getting worse. Like it's incredible to know that there's never been more diverse, number of people making country music.
Yeah.
And there's been, fewer and fewer opportunities for those people to get recognized. And then into that whole mess comes Beyonce cratering in. And she forces, I think, a conversation that's like on at least a slightly higher decibel level.
Yeah. There's a great review in Pitchfork by Julian Escobedo.
Julian Escobedo, yes.
Where she points out, like, what Beyonce has done with this record is force an ongoing conversation about what is country. So even if you think this isn't country, she has wedged this conversation into the national conversation. And like, that is power, right? Like,
that is power.
Let's have a genre conversation for months. Like, wow.
And it's with the very opening words of this record, right? Like, nothing really ends. For things to stay the same, they have to change again. Like, she is, again, signaling the idea of genre as something that has remained. I mean, like, to me, this album is a protest album against the concept of genre and how the idea of genre has become, like a microcosm of or corollary of racism in general. The way that, genre operates is actually the same way that institutional racism operates. The same mechanisms that keep certain people confined to certain genres as opposed to other genres. Like, and people maybe don't think enough about genre right now because, you kind of go like, well, I listen to this genre and this genre. But like, literally music is divided into this way, right? Like, your radio stations on your dial are separated by genre. Yeah. Like, every sort of, every way that you engage with music is a little bit separated by genre. This is all a product of that racism that you're talking about. Like, the thing that you mentioned earlier, the division between race records and hillbilly records, that's because of a man named Ralph Peer who, went to the American South and he was like, oh, I shall dub these people making hillbilly music. They're white people because it'll be easier to sell to white audiences. And then we'll sell race records to black audiences. And literally that is the birth of the modern genre. It is a product of capitalism and racism coming together. And I don't know a lot of people who are rooting for capitalism and racism, let alone a love child of those two forces. But that's how we organize music. And so when Beyonce makes this record and she has someone like Linda Martell, right. Who, again, if you see the name Linda Martell show on this album, you go, I don't know who that is. If you spend 5 seconds looking it up, you'll realize that Linda Martell was the first black woman to play at the Grand Ole Opry. And then she was largely written out of history. We're in a bit of a moment of recognizing Linda Martell and her contributions right now, which is great. But for a long, long time, we didn't recognize what she gave to us. So for her to say, hey, genre is kind of a funny little concept, it's a little silly actually, feels extra powerful, but also the kind of detail that you can very easily miss because you're on your way to listening to Spaghetti or on your way to listen to Yaya and you're like, let's go, I want to party. Beyonce, can I just get to my body moving?
Right, but she says it like it's right there. And it's not even like, oh, it's in the liner notes or whatever. Like, you need to listen to Linda Martell saying, genre is a funny little concept. Like, oh, maybe you should think again about what you're thinking about whether this is or isn't country. Okay, so we have a question that explicitly calls this out that I think will give you and I a little bit of a chance to talk about contemporary country and where this fits. So this comes from Allison.
I love Beyonce's new album, but why do a number of the songs not feel country to me? I've been racking my brain as to what defines country, and mostly come down to I know it when I hear it. I realize she winks at this at the beginning of Spaghetti, but I would love a musical analysis of what we generally equate with country music and what Beyonce does in Cowboy Carter that breaks some of those expectations, and how all that interplays with race, because I'm sure it does.
So
love that question.
Yeah, such a good question. I was listening to the reaction episode of Switched on Pop to this album, and both of them, their reaction was like, this isn't country, it's something more interesting. And I get that reaction, and I think we see a lot of that. But I actually think this album sounds really country to me because country is much more expansive than I think most people understand, especially if they're not super familiar with country. Like, if you've only heard some Dixie Chicks, some Toby Keith, maybe some
Brooks.
Tim McGraw, some Garth Brooks, like 90s country, and then maybe some like what I think of as like contemporary hee-haw country, which is like, what's his name who's on The Voice, who's married? Blake Shelton. Like that style. And I'm not even talking about like alt country, which is super expansive in so many different directions. Like contemporary country, top 40 country, often sounds
right
like
now.
R&B, right? Like there are so many different, like there's trap music in country music right now. There's rap in country music.
Yeah, there sure is. But I would say two things. One, the idea of what's country and what's not country has been a central pillar of country music conversation since time immemorial. That is like a pure function of how we talk about country music. Shania Twain wasn't considered country when she first came out because they were like, hey, these drums, they sound a lot like the guy from Def Leppard because guess what? Produced by the same dude. And so people were like, no, I don't know what this is, but it sure can't qualify as country. We're not going to allow this. There is something about country music that is kind of regularly like a forest fire. You know, we kind of like burn a little part and go like, no, this will not be allowed to be country music. And then what grows there is something that is borrowing elements of country music in order to push the genre forward. There's sort of a continual sort of renewal within country. And then the other thing about it is that I think part of the thesis of this record is saying, you have been lied to your whole life if you think that country music is this certain set of characteristics. If you think that country music is like has these limitations, because the only times that country music has been allowed to expand is when it is financially, profitable for giant record companies that control radio, that control, which artists get promoted and which artists do not get promoted. So when you listen to Morgan Wallen and you're listening to the snap drums on a Morgan Wallen record, you're like, these are explicitly hip hop snap drums. Like they are directly borrowed from hip hop. For the last 10 years or so, 11 years or so, the cadences of how so many artists in country music sing have just been like little R&B runs on top of guitar licks. Country music has been allowed to be expansive. It's a matter of who's not allowed to be included in that expansion. And I think like Beyoncé is trying to say, if this genre will continue to sort of borrow from other genres in order to expand itself as a commercial enterprise, I think we need to get back to the artistic enterprise, which is to say it's also allowed to be expansive. And that's just from a purely sort of functional point of view. I think Beyonce's trying to make an argument of saying you've been lied to a little bit if you think that like, hey, country music to me is like Trisha Yearwood, because it is, and I love Trisha Yearwood and I ride for her every day. But country music is also allowed to be a sort of a wider definition of all these artists who are kind of challenging the sonic palette by saying, you know what, I'm going to borrow from all these ideas that exist in country music, but also push it forward. The most memorable example that I can think of this is Casey Musgrave's album Golden Hour, because like Golden Hour is an album that is like, it's purely sort of genre bending, genre blending exercises. I mean, she has songs on there that are like, what if country but like disco drums? What would that sound like? What if country music but like actually we made it like really sad and folky in some parts, but then also like immediately paired it with like what you recognize as like really sort of big pop music mechanics. To me, like Beyonce is trying to say, I've been watching and you guys have not been really limiting who gets to call themselves country except for certain people. And so I'm now sort of admitting myself into this canon as well.
Well, and here's the thing. Country music is obsessed with itself. And I mean that like it is so incredibly self-referential. Right now, if you listen to contemporary country, you will hear songs that are about, like a song that is about George Strait, a song that is explicitly about Tim McGraw and Faith Hill's love for one another, right?
Correct.
A song that is about finding someone in a bar who is listening to a 90s country song. And it reworks that country song as the song, right?
I think you're referring to Heads Carolina, Tails California.
Amazing
which has been
song.
Incredible song. And it's also been like, which has been recently reworked to say like, actually like, She Had Me at Heads Carolina,
Yes.
which is to say, you know, like this guy's like just shows up at a bar, and then she started singing the song as you know, for her karaoke song, and he fell in love with her. But he uses the chorus of the original song to say this, right?
Yes.
Like, self-referential is, you know, is country music's bread and butter.
So not only is Beyonce doing this with Cowboy Carter, right? There are so many different ways that she is referencing country music, but she's also expanding the palette
Yes.
to be like, oh, I can do that too. But also, maybe you missed a couple people. Like, isn't it interesting who your
it's interesting how
focus
these people
is?
didn't get included. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also sounds that should have been like somewhat obvious to include, but that have not made it to the mainstream yet. Like, I think of the beginning of Tyrant, for example, and you hear that fiddle, and then the fiddle gets a trap drum immediately, and I'm like, okay, so we've just invented fiddle trap. Let's go. I'm ready for many artists to explore the sound. Riverdance, which is one of my favorite songs on this record, is just like taking a riff of old Irish folk music and being like, what if a house beat on this? Then what? You know?
Yeah.
And again, that's how a genre moves forward. It sort of borrows from the moment to recast itself as something new. And in that way, that's about as country as you can get.
Yeah.
Is trying to take something from the past and saying this is how it speaks to right now. I think country music is very discursive in that way, and I think like a lot of other genres don't have that quality. And I think I really love Beyonce's contribution to that dimension.
She also, we should just, for people who are like, I think most people know a lot of the very obvious references, but like there's a moment where she does a bit of Patsy Cline's I Fall to Pieces, which I just love. She does this duet with Miley Cyrus, who also very interesting country artist, right? Like, and also has like a place in the country music lineage. She's Dolly Parton's goddaughter. She has a very famous cover of Jolene, and then we haven't talked about yet.
I love that you just didn't mention she's the daughter of country royalty.
Oh, yeah,
Billy
she's
Ray
also
Cyrus,
the daughter.
She's also that, but don't worry about
country
it.
90s royalty.
Yes,
and then there's the fact that she also has like the explicit, I don't know, like the blessing of both Dolly Parton and Willie Nelson, who play prominently in the various interstitials. And I love how she does like this play on like the crackly country music AM radio, which is Willie Nelson.
with Willie Nelson as your host. But even that, like the way that it moves through that is like so interesting because you hear these snippets and you again, those snippets can move past you pretty quickly. You're like, I don't know what this interstitial is doing here. But if you slow down to pay enough attention, like you got like blues legend Son House, followed by like, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, followed by, I think it was like Roy Hamilton that you hear in there. You hear Chuck Berry. Like, again, she's saying the history of American popular music that is being introduced to you by people like Willie Nelson rests on Black people and the innovations of Black people. And I think like Willie Nelson as a choice is interesting to me because Willie Nelson is very old, and I don't mean this, in a dramatic way. I literally mean he would have been alive while exactly right. He would have been alive while these people were working.
Yeah.
He would have been alive during the segregation of Black artists and white artists from one another. I think having him as a link is a very explicit choice of like, the people that you hold up now, the people who are on your Mount Rushmore of country music now, they remember this history. You should take their word for it, because if you're not going to take my word for it. So like it's like the ultimate, you know what, you're trying to gatekeep me. I'm going to bring you the guy who actually built this entire house, because his endorsement means everything in this moment.
So we talked a little bit about how what's the lead single?
Texas Hold'em?
How it went to the top. Yeah, how it went to the top of the charts, right? And it's the first time for a Black artist who isn't Tracy Chapman, being covered by Luke Combs.
Yes.
I think a Black woman specifically.
Oh, yeah. Darius Rucker has had some hits.
He's had a few hits here and there.
I'm just going to say that I think the country music, like mainstream country music, uses Darius Rucker as like we can't be racist. We got Hootie, right?
And there's a long history of country music being like, well, there can be one. You get one per generation. Right. And, for a while, Darius was that guy. I think they hide a little bit behind Kane Brown, for example, and for a little while, Jimmy Allen. Before that, the long history of like everything that Charlie Pride gave us. And like Charlie Pride, extraordinary career. Country's Black First Superstar is a very well-earned moniker. But for some time, country was like, well, there's one. So why would we have to act on, introducing another one? There is sort of a complacency within the structures of country music there. But sorry, you were gonna talk about
I was
Texas
going to
Hold'em.
ask you if you have heard Texas Hold'em on the radio, because I listen to Canadian radio here on the border.
Nice. Love this for me.
JR Country 93.7 coming out of Vancouver. I love it. It is my favorite country station I've ever listened to, and I have listened to many. And because it lacks most, if not all, of the ideological positioning that comes out of most U.S. country.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Love
I
that.
know that there's stuff still, like, I'm not trying to
Sure, country
make
music is still a
Canada awesome
signifier
here.
of what is a signifier of, yes.
Right, but like I don't know, like there's just less of the like, around here we do this or what, like they will air PSAs about like restitution payments for Indigenous schools, and they will advertise gay pride events, which is something that you would very rarely, if ever, see on it in a United States.
I love learning this about you, that you listen to Canadian country radio. That's a delight to me.
It's
you might
on
not
the
know,
dial. It's on, which is the best place to listen to country music is in your
Of course.
car, right?
100%, that's correct. What you might not know, though, is that like Canada has what we call CanCon regulations, which means that radio stations have to, and I mean all radio stations, have to play a minimum of 35% Canadian music. So you might,
Yes, I get a lot of Canadian country.
So I was gonna say you're being exposed to a lot of Canadian
Yes.
country music that
Yes.
is like not at all. You'd be like, I don't know what they're referring to.
No, it's so
yeah.
good. And it's not just
Great.
Shania. Like, it's like, here's this new Canadian artist. It's so great.
Oh yeah. Country music is big here, in the sense that we have a lot of people who create country, and it's like it has its own little ecosystem. It's the best.
And what I was going to say is that when the single first came out, they played it and they said, and I was like, oh, geez. They said, text in your reactions. And I remember I was driving into town and I was like, oh gosh, we're going to
Like,
see
hope
what
this goes
happens
well.
here. And apparently they said 50-50 for and against. And they read I'm sure that there was some racist stuff that came in that they opted not to say.
Option not to show. Yeah.
But they just said, like, some people are like, I'm digging it. I like it. It sounds like some other country. And then some people are like, I just don't know what I don't like about it. And I'm like,
Yeah, do you want to maybe investigate that feeling a little bit more? Because I truly, like, Texas Hold'em is a soft pitch down the middle. I mean, like, this is a song that is like, if you're not gonna play this, then I don't know what you're gonna play.
Right.
Because there's no reason for you not to play this. It fits within everything that you do. But even then, like, the choices that she's making in that song, which has 2 Canadian writers on it, which is incredible. She also has Rhiannon Giddens on the banjo on that. And Rhiannon Giddens, one of the most respected artists in Americana at the moment. And that's her on the banjo. And like, it's such a delight, if you know who Rhiannon Giddens is, to see that this is the voice and the sound that Beyonce is choosing to play with. It's great.
yeah. So have you heard it on the radio?
I have not heard it on the radio. That's because I mostly listen to my own music. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm so sorry to country radio listeners. When I'm out of the city, I tend to listen to the radio. But when I'm in the city, I got a lot of playlist, pal,
Yeah. I mean, you're a much more sophisticated listener. I go between the country music station and then the top 40, also from Vancouver radio station, and also a
Strong
delight.
choices.
Also
That's strong choices being made. I love this.
Okay. So now we're going to have a whole conversation on Jolene, which will be exclusive to our paid subscribers. So if you desperately need to hear our hot takes on whether or not Beyonce's cover of Jolene is a skip, head over to culturestudypod.substack.com. So, Elamine, this was such a pleasurable, fantastic conversation, and I hope listeners also felt that way.
Oh my God. Thank you for having me to
Yeah.
talk about Beyonce at length, one of my favorite hobbies in the world.
And country.
And country. These are the 2 things I love. Beyonce, country music combined together, and then we just get to talk as long as we want about it. That's amazing.
Where can people find more of you on the internet, in their podcast feed, if they want to?
If you must come find me, I am no. Please do. I would like to be perceived. I really like attention. On Instagram, I'm at Elamin, Elamin. My show is called Commotion. You can find Commotion with Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. And on Twitter, I'm very sorry to still be tweeting. I don't mean to be this way. But unfortunately, I am, while I'm deprogramming myself to do that, I'm on Twitter at Elamin88, Elamin88. That's it. That's me, buddy.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many amazing episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, check out the show notes for a link to our Google form, or head to tinyurl.com/culturestudypod. If you want to support the show, make it sustainable, pay Melody's salary, get all the bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. Today's episode will also feature a hearty lineup of links and YouTube videos to continue going down this rabbit hole if you want. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.